Amiga Format. It was my magazine of choice from 1989 to the start of 1994 when I sold my Amiga 500. It was my source of news, reviews, tutorials and cheat codes. And it's those short years that I remember as perhaps my fondest when it comes to computer magazines. Perhaps it was the sense of being there from the start of something new with issue 1, or the way the magazine gathered momentum and fulfilled its potential in parallel with the Amiga itself, shadowing in particular the Amiga 500 and the popularity of that system in the UK. The magazine averaged over 161,000 sales per month at its peak in the first half of '92, with its mix of gaming, hardware, applications and creativity, its insights into the bright future of the platform, and then, in latter years, the search for hope as the Amiga was passed from one company to the next in the wake of Commodore's demise. Today I wanted to share something from the Cave library that I love, but also to discover what I missed out on when I abandoned the platform and the magazine. A tech nibble on the highs, the lows and my personal memories of the UK's most popular Amiga magazine, Amiga Format. Yes, for all the excitement that's been happening here at the Retro Collective lately, I thought I'd bring you into one of my favourite areas, the library, and dive into one of my favourite magazines of all time, Amiga Format, and the world of games and 3D rendered cows. Anyway, October 1987 is when the humble Amiga 500, the low-cost version of the Amiga, arrived here on UK shores. It reduced the cost of entry into the Commodore Amiga ecosystem, which had suffered a confused start in life. The 500 made Commodore's machine price competitive with the Atari ST range, both of which were attractive to those who wanted to upgrade from the likes of the Commodore 64, or to us in the UK, a nation accustomed to the low-cost Sinclair and Amstrad 8-bit offerings we may have started out on. The Atari had a head start with the ST, but when the 500 arrived, both systems fared well and were seen to be rivals with more than a passing resemblance inside and out. It's no surprise then that as 16-bit ownership gathered momentum, that they would be catered for in magazines, and the Amiga and ST were chosen by Future Publishing for the imaginatively titled ST Amiga Format from July of 1988. This, the precursor to Amiga Format, ran for 13 issues and claimed to be the complete package for Atari ST and Commodore Amiga owners. It stood out as being well written and informative, covering serious applications of the machines, but without, and this was important to me, without sneering at games. Each issue had a dual format cover disc of demos and utilities, despite their differing file systems, and the style and sections of the magazine will be familiar to early Amiga format readers and indeed ST format readers, but we'll come to that shortly. Although circuit diagrams to build your own hardware like this speech synth in issue 8 were few and far between. It wasn't expected of you to know how to use a soldering iron to own an entry-level micro, as it may well have been 10 years prior. The screenplay section is where game reviews happened, simultaneously assessing the game for both platforms, where it was available on both, and awarding the Format Gold Award to titles achieving a score of 90% or higher. Game Busters is where hints, tips and cheats are sent in and shared by readers, such as this tip for Arkanoid in issue 4 from Andrew Davidson in Bournemouth of Dorset. I wonder if that was the same Andy Davidson who went on to create Worms. It's just 13 issues later when we see this chap smiling as he runs from an explosion, perhaps of his own making, clutching an ST monitor. And there is an image very faintly on that monitor somehow. And the magazine explodes into two individual titles with it, ST Format and Amiga Format. This division marks the confidence ST Amiga Format has in the ST and Amiga markets, reads the update in the final issue. Both are now strong enough to warrant a magazine with a disc on the cover every month. This certainly wasn't the case early last year. We're also treated to the cover image of each new magazine, although neither image would be used in the final copy. The first ST Format cover saw more explosions with this striking Ghosts in the Machine strapline, and Amiga Format plumping for a lady shouldering a video camera with the title Unleash the Power, How Video Can Transform Your Amiga, both appearing on our shelves in August of 1989. The original ST Amiga Format crew were largely assigned by Future Publishing to the new ST Format magazine, and that included editor Richard Montiero, production editor Stuart Anderton, Mark Higham on games, renamed to Mark Prima Donna Higham in issue 1, I'm sure there was a good reason for that. Gordon Druce, Greg Higham and Louise Cockcroft were assigned design, publishing and advertising duties respectively.
Speaking of ad responsibilities, it's PCBWay.com. What could be better than Amiga Format and PCBWay.com in one video? Wow! PCBWay offer 3D printing, CNC milling, injection molding and, get this, PCB services all in one place. You can even order a brand new Amiga 500. Just search for Amiga 500 mainboard in their shared projects. There's no other way, all you can do is PCBWay.com. More words. End of advert. Let's go!
It was pretty much the same team from ST Amiga Format who would now be running the new ST Format magazine. And there was a callback that reflected this in the Not Another Magazine introduction to the very first ST Amiga Format in issue 1 here. And then when we get to ST Format issue 1, we see, oh no, not another magazine.
Not another one?
Reflecting perhaps the continuity of the team there. The Amiga Format team, however, was sourced elsewhere. Future had just sold another magazine, ACE, or Advanced Computer Entertainment, to competitor EMAP Publishing, a multi-platform magazine which was founded in 1987. Bob Wade, Steve Jarrett and Damien Noonan were among those at ACE who would be assigned to the Amiga Format offices, and in time each would get a shot at being the Amiga Format editor, starting with Bob Wade. Some would make the leap from ST Amiga Format to Amiga Format, such as Jason Holborn, who was the cover disc coordinator and then becomes the technical editor for Amiga Format, and others would hold a role in both magazines, such as Louise on advertising and Greg in publishing. I'm sure there would have been healthy competition between these new magazines, but I'm also certain that Future Publishing would have encouraged collaboration, particularly in the early days, in the name of success for both the magazines and the company overall. But readers, particularly of Amiga Format, weren't without their concerns. People like Tim Gathercole in the Format Letters section of issue 1 was asking, can I have the editor's assurance that Amiga Format will not degenerate into yet another games magazine? And he duly receives that assurance. And so Amiga Format is born, and I excitedly rode my bike to the local corner shop to buy a copy on the day it came out, delighted that my beloved Amiga would have a magazine all of its own, unsullied by that dastardly Atari ST. And I'm sure someone else was doing exactly the same with the Atari ST and ST Format. So let's take a look now at issue 1 of Amiga Format. Here it is. There has never been a better time to own an Amiga, cites the first of 6 editors in the magazine's lifetime. The Amiga is taking off like never before, and we at Amiga Format are here to help you make the most of it, it reads. 116 pages of nothing but Amiga content landed in August 1989, and it wasn't too big a shock to the system. A feeling of familiarity and continuity was present for ST Amiga Format readers, despite the new team. And the cover disc was really important to me. On this issue 1, I played that New Zealand story demo to death. And it was a good game too. It really did show off the platform. And I sat and I watched the Swinging Frog demo for, well, way too long on its infinite loop. But every disc came with the promise of showing me something new, something I didn't know my machine might be capable of. And I loved exploring them. At least until I got Xcopy and needed a blank disc in a hurry, and those cover discs were right there begging to be used for piracy, but let's move on quickly. Kickoff, New Zealand Story and Powerdrome were the first 3 games to receive the Amiga Format Gold Award, and worthy of it they were too. Using measures of graphics, sound, intellect and addiction on each game before giving an overall score. Addiction going hand in hand with replayability and therefore value for money. Although the new ST format instead favoured short-term and long-term interest in their reviews instead of addiction. In Amiga Format that would be replaced by issue 18, as seen in this example, a less than complimentary score for Domark's race driving, where we've just got the verdict and some bullet points instead. It became obvious within the first 10 issues or so that the Amiga, or the Amiga 500 in particular here, was gaining massive momentum and the magazine with it. The coming attractions section, such as this one in issue 2, promised more and more games that would take advantage of the system's custom chips, as developers' confidence grew in the growing user base of the system and could give the Amiga the time and energy that it deserved. Lustworthy hardware would appear for review. First from Commodore, such as this A590 hard disk, who didn't want that, and then from third parties, such as the Mega Midget Racer, cramming in a 68030 CPU and a 68882 FPU into your Amiga, including the A500 for £800 fully loaded. That's more than the price of the computer itself, but of course many more options existed. That's an extreme example. The balance of game reviews and more serious content was fairly evenly split. Cover discs complemented tutorials and reviews, such as clip art for deluxe paint, including this kind of police photo fit clip art set, which I found highly amusing at the time, kind of like a digital Mr. Potato Head in issue 3. Jason Holborn answered our technical questions in the Workbench section, giving hints and tips on everything from Amiga Basic to upgrading your Agnes chip. And the magazine reviewed the increasing selection of applications for the platform, such as word processors, CAD design, or MIDI sequencing. Yeah, we can do MIDI too. And if you were convinced, like me, then you could subscribe for the sum of just $29.95 for 12 issues, which also included an additional backstage newsletter and subscribers super disc with even more utilities to play with. Fair to say that I was happy. I was delighted with this new magazine. Chris Clifford, on the other hand, was not a happy bunny. "There could be a little fewer games pages," he said, "and if I want games reviews, then I'll read a games magazine." Meanwhile, Tony Melling complains that the "Disc, Old Son" was a big letdown. Greg Ingham said readers will get twice the amount of programs on disc, and I expected you to pull out all the stops for your first issue to show us what we could expect in future, the aspect of which is decidedly less rosy if this disc is an example. He goes on to say that he nearly subscribed, but he didn't because the magazine is a few pages smaller than ST Amiga Format was, and his distaste for the cover disc leads him to consider the magazine to be worth just £1.50 and not the £2.95 asking price. Bob Wade points out that a few pages less is many pages more if you factor in that there is no ST content anymore, which is likely irrelevant to you as an Amiga owner. Do sit down, Tony. The first 17 issues of Amiga Format really do document well the rise of the platform here in the UK, getting ever larger as content jostles with advertisers vying for attention. This issue 18, dated January 1991 but on the shelves in December, such as the way the magazines came out, is where the magazine really goes into overdrive. It's this month it's reported that over 2 million Amigas have now been sold worldwide, 500,000 of which are Amiga 500s, which have sold in the UK alone. We also had other models here, of course, like the 2000, but just let that sink in for a moment. Right here in the UK, over a quarter of all Amigas that existed in the world were here on our small island, and Amiga Format was at the heart of all this excitement. Boasting 300 pages and 2 cover discs, I have a suspicion that our letter writers Tony and Chris may have moved on to another magazine now, because overwhelming volumes of games for the Amiga is of course steering the content, especially at Christmas time. And the lowish cost of the Amiga 500 also means we're a young demographic and, well, we loved games. For many, myself included, that love of Amiga games developed into curiosity. How are the games made? Or an interest in the creative arts surrounding them, graphic design, music creation. And thankfully, Amiga Format recognised and catered to that with things like Dave Jones's games programming section. Dave Jones from DMA Design, of course, who had games like Menace published on the Psygnosis label. Games reviews were front and centre with no fewer than 34 games rated in issue 18, but for all the pizzazz about the top 100 games and the future of games on the cover, more than half the magazine was still dedicated to other topics: interfacing with robots, 3D modelling with Real 3D, and I think this is where I'm expected to say something about Amiga's rendering graphics for Babylon 5, but I refuse. Games were the accessible front door to microcomputers, appealing to teenagers like me. What Amiga Format did so well in this period was to steer us through our enjoyment of games into the more serious topics. Let the magazine hold your hand through creating a music track with Music X, although I'm not sure the bag of muesli was essential there. And to inspire you, here's a disc with tools, but also a music cassette to listen to. It was pitched perfectly, and I say that reading it back now in the modern day, and not just through nostalgia and rose-tinted spectacles. And did you know that 24 Amiga 2000s were used to render the CGI in the first series? Oh, god damn it! Under Bob Wade's stewardship, Amiga Format set out its stall. It established itself as the best-selling Amiga magazine and was on a steep trajectory upwards. It was in March 1991, issue 20, that Damien Noonan moved from deputy editor to editor and took the magazine to its peak in the first half of 92. Damien was editor from March 91 through to February 93 in what I'll describe as the fat era of Amiga Format, when the magazine was at its most popular and the pages at their thickest. In this era, Damien continues to walk the line that Bob Wade set out and find the balance of gaming and productivity in the magazine really well, especially as the Amiga hits its peak in gaming with games such as Sensible Soccer, the Chaos Engine and Syndicate. But each issue counterbalanced that gaming greatness and a fair pile of gaming stinkers with insights and tutorials. Amiga Format readers, myself included, were rendering beautiful 3D fractal landscapes with Vista in issue 33. What's a fractal? What's a Mandelbrot set? Well, Amiga Format taught me all of this. I'd leave a scene rendering when I went to school in the morning and excitedly check back when I got home after a whole day of the CPU working away. Sometimes to find a stunning landscape, sometimes to find I'd just rendered the solid grey of a mountainside. But that was all part of the fun. Amos on issue 42 or Blitz Basic on issue 52 and their accompanying guides provided easy but powerful ways into programming with all the functions you needed to make your own games. DevPack 2 came on issue 39 with tips from Bullfrog if you really wanted to roll your sleeves up and get into assembly. And Imagine, worth £269 apparently, was the December 93 cover disc to guide us into the world of ray tracing, as seen through the spectacles of a John Lennon lookalike on the cover. Imagine that. But by far the most influential issue for me was issue 29 with its cover disc of Octamed, an 8-channel music creation program, which was quite a feat as the Amiga was supposed to only be able to do 4 channels. This was a tracker. It didn't rely on music notation or theory. Anyone could start throwing samples down and creating their own music. And that one disc was worth every single copy of Amiga Format I ever bought, which was about 55 of them, but we'll get to that later. There was one tutorial that was a bit of an eye-opener though. July 1992, issue 36, this is PaintPot 2, a seemingly innocent paint program for little hands. Imagine my surprise then when the instructions were titled, "Type some shit in here please." Laugh? I was incontinent for days after I saw that as a teenager. The following issue did give an apology and a replacement title to cut out and stick in its place, if you didn't mind destroying what was on the other side of that page. Having hit its peak of circulation in early 1992, Damien Noonan hands over editorial duties to Marcus Dyson, formerly the art editor, in March 93. This is a big year for Commodore and indeed anyone who depends on the Amiga ecosystem, including this very magazine. By now, the original Amiga platform is showing its age, tinkering around the edges, repackaging existing hardware into new form factors like the CD-TV, and making minor upgrades to the 500 with the 500 Plus or the 600 without the numpad. They're just not cutting it, and the next generation of Amiga is past due. Not that Amiga Format would say that out loud. They, like other magazines, champion new hardware from Commodore. Amiga Format also play their part in promoting the new generation, nurturing the community and helping out vendors with their Amiga Format live shows such as this one in 1993, hosting a wealth of software and hardware vendors at the Wembley Exhibition Centre. It's been quite a year for the Amiga, says Marcus. The launch of the A1200 and A4000 brought the machines up to date, with 32-bit processing power and 256 colour screen displays. And the public obviously approved. Did they, Marcus? Did they? The fall of Commodore wasn't upon us yet though, it was merely tap dancing on a trapdoor hoping that nobody would pull the lever in 1994. And Amiga Format continued to spoil us and shower us with optimism for the next wave of hardware. Supplementary books were included in our mags such as this one on how to get the most out of your Amiga. And while we didn't quite see the obesity of issue 18's 300 pages again, issue 54, Christmas 1993, was perhaps the last great hurrah from the heyday of the Amiga's life cycle. Sporting red and green translucent cover discs and a special Christmas cannon fodder / Sensible Soccer crossover by Sensible Software, this was a whopper. And just look at what was being released for the system. No, not you, Rise of the Robots. Frontier Elite 2. Hang on, when did we get the addiction rating back? October 1993 apparently, I had to go back and check, but there's no explanation from Marcus as to why addiction is back. Anyway, in addition to Frontier Elite 2, we also see F-117A Nighthawk, Cannon Fodder, and The Settlers. 3 games that I loved, and 3 games that show the breadth of genres that the Amiga could accommodate and the quality it was capable of producing at its peak. And yes, I know these games made it to other platforms too, but 2 of them were made specifically for the Amiga before being ported to other systems. And Cannon Fodder actually gets reviewed twice in this issue, thanks to a promotional supplement for Amiga Power being included, and that accounts for some of the bulk of the magazine. And it's on this high that we boldly marched into 1994 as Amiga owners, or at least some of us did, because it's here that I waved my little white flag and said that's enough for me. Because I wasn't an Amiga owner in isolation. I had friends who owned PCs, and at first I thought their monochrome PC speaker machines were an expensive waste of money if you were interested in games like I was. But as they evolved, as the DX266, the Sound Blaster, the VGA cards appeared in my friend's machine, and of course the speed of a hard disk, games like Need for Speed, Ultima 7, I was tempted away. And the future of the Amiga just didn't look promising enough for me. Our editor Marcus though was not put off, and he was now back in the Amiga CD32, the consoleized 1200 with a CD drive. The CD32 has not been without its detractors, he says. Many of them right here at Future Towers, though not in this office, rest assured. But now the joke's on them. CD32 is a success, it's official. We really believe this. And I for one am not afraid to put my money where my mouth is. Well, sorry Marcus, but really believing something doesn't make it official, mate. Dave Roberts also says, I don't want to alarm anyone, but it now seems pretty clear that the CD32 has got off to a bit of a flyer. On what planet, Dave? And so I, like many others, said goodbye to Amiga Format, to adverts for 17-bit software, Premiere mail order, and to Special Reserve, who I sent many a postal order to for my games, and even to the odd one inviting me to get ripped and build muscles fast, that would sometimes appear in the back of the magazine. I packed up my Amiga 500, my A570 CD-ROM drive, my extra floppy drive and extra RAM, and sold it to my neighbour for £200 to put towards that Packard Bell. It felt like the right thing to do then, and it still does now. But Amiga Format lived on. Wasn't all about me, you know. There was a whole new cohort of Amiga 1200 and 600 owners who needed to be catered for, at least for 2 or 3 years, because they've made that investment, or their parents have made that investment in a machine, and it's not going to get upgraded for a while. Another 81 issues of Amiga Format would come out before the life support switch was flicked. So what did I miss out on then, I wonder? Despite Marcus's confidence in the CD32 in May 1994, he's credited as Goodbye Editor Marcus Dyson, and June sees the arrival of Steve Jarrett.
This building may not be very familiar to you, but I'm sure that the magazines we make inside are. This is the home of Future Publishing, Europe's biggest publisher of computers magazines. My name's Steve Jarrett, and I'm the editor of one of those magazines, perhaps the best known of all, Amiga Format. Before we get down to business, perhaps you'd like to take a look inside.
A very experienced hand who worked for Crash and Zap64, he's credited as a contributor all the way back in issue 1 of Amiga Format, and then went on to launch Commodore Format in 1990. He's also the editor of Edge magazine for its launch in 1993. If anyone can guide Amiga Format through a difficult year, than Steve Jarrett can. What's the first thing he talks about? Babylon bloody 5.
Anyway, let's leave them to get on with their work. Let's go to my desk.
And what's difficult about this year is that Commodore filed for bankruptcy on the 29th of April. Commodore Shock News reads issue 60 in June 1994, a triple cover disc special, which is as good value as it ever was, at the increased price of £3.95. That shock news being that Commodore has gone into voluntary liquidation, and how Colin Proudfoot, the joint MD of Commodore UK, tries to steady the ship and nerves and keep consumer confidence. Now, this isn't an episode about the downfall of Commodore, it's all about Amiga Format magazine, but of course the magazine predictably, as it followed the rise of the platform, especially the 500 here, it follows the demise. The advertisers haven't cottoned on yet, but the reducing number of reviews, the quality of the titles, the idea that the magazine will be orphaned, dependent on a mystery buyer or third-party hardware, starts to carry an air of desperation. Readership goes into a steep decline in early 1994. I wasn't the only one to jump ship, it seems. But remember, that fall is coming from a great peak. Amiga Format was huge. By 1996, Amiga Format still has a circulation of around 45,000 copies per month. They soldiered on. August 94, 5 years after launching the magazine, is when we see a slightly new, moodier look taking on with the black spines, and the talk is of CD-ROM drives for A1200 owners after Commodore's own was sunk with the company. January and February 1995 sees something of a renaissance by Steve Jarrett, a last hurrah as he hands over to Nick Veitch as the editor. These two early 95 issues lean into everything that made the magazine great, including a full version of Amos Professional on the cover disc. All those who perhaps got a 1200 or a 600 for Christmas still needed to be catered for. Sensible World of Soccer reports the magazine sold 70,000 copies for Christmas. A reminder that there's still a strong market for a sub £1,000 computer out there, but PCs were becoming more affordable by the day. Far from becoming a pamphlet, Amiga Format managed to remain relevant through 95 and 96, just dipping below 30,000 sales per month going into 1997. Navigating Amiga owners through accessing the internet without the support of mainstream web browsers seen on PCs and Macs would soon be on the menu, helping Amiga owners come together in solidarity online. Amiga saved, announces issue 72. ESCOM buys Commodore and new Amigas are on the way. The first of many such stories, but a really nice article in this issue celebrates 10 years of the Amiga computer. This year, incidentally, we're celebrating 40 years of it. The original editor, Bob Wade, is back in this issue to share his thoughts on the market as it stands in 95. Without the Amiga, there is no computer for under £500 that can compete with the attraction of the new 32 and 64-bit consoles. And the relevance of all this? In 10 years' time, where are the new generation of games writers going to come from? You can't learn to program on consoles, and PCs are expensive and still relatively unfriendly, he says. And while that didn't hold true for long, PCs did drop in price, but few to sub £500 levels. It didn't take much to install Pascal or Turbo C and get programming on one. All of the other editors up to this point also share their views in this article. It's well worth a read. By December 1996, Andy Smith notes in the Screenplay Game section, one thing that's become noticeable over the last few months is the quality of the games making it onto the streets. This month we had 2 full commercial releases. One's a complete dog, and the other isn't as good as it may have been. Those games being Kung Fu, which scores 20%, and Blobs, scoring 71%. And for goodness sake, don't play Kung Fu. In fact, I'd recommend you go and watch Kim Justice's video about the worst reviewed games through the history of Amiga Format, which I'll link to in the video description if you really want to see it. But the shaky foundations of aging hardware design can only prop sales up for so long. If it's games you want, then the new generation of consoles, such as the Sony PlayStation, are affordable enough to tempt away 600 and 1200 owners, and readership will soon be concentrated down to the most determined of Amiga owners and those who can navigate their way through accelerators, decanting their wedge Amiga into a tower case, PowerPC upgrades, and a plethora of ways of keeping your Amiga relevant without that simple low-cost wedge machine as a point of entry into the ecosystem. Issue 85, June 1996, is when the magazine offers a cover CD alternative to the floppy cover disc. Impressively, it's not really until early 1998 that the publication becomes noticeably slimmer. And look at the news. Now Gateway are buying Amiga, and the next Amiga will blow your socks off. Honest, pinky promise, Amiga is back, everyone. Although it's undoubtedly good news that there's going to be an Amiga resurgence in a couple of years' time, what are we going to be doing until then? Asks Andy Smith. What indeed? And so the magazine tried to do what it does best. It tried to keep us occupied. It showered us in tutorials and education. 3D design continued to be a staple in the tutorials section, with programs such as Lightwave, and no doubt plenty got their start in CAD and 3D animation on the Amiga. And what magazine in the second half of the 90s didn't have HTML and website design tutorials? The Amiga was no exception. The wait, however, for Andy Smith's fabled Amiga resurgence, I'm afraid, was a little too long for Amiga Format to weather. August 1999 saw a skinnier than ever issue 126 celebrate 10 years of the magazine, and the final editor, Ben Vost, who appeared in April 99, didn't know it yet, but he was about to go down with the ship. I hope, he says in 1999, that in 10 years from now, when we're celebrating Amiga Format's 20th anniversary, we'll be doing so from a position as the world's best-selling computer magazine. It was just 10 issues later when Future Publishing finally closed the doors on Amiga Format with issue 136 in May 2000 with a farewell issue. Amiga Format had existed in 3 separate decades through 6 editors, and it had arrived on a wave of optimism that this might gain traction in the UK through its rise, its success and its downfall. It guided us through discovering fields of computing we might otherwise never have touched, for many inviting us in with the promise of gaming and then magically engaging us in something we didn't even know existed, let alone had an interest in a way that only the very best teachers can do. And thanks to the loyal following and respect to the 11,000 people who were still buying the magazine every month at the very end of its life, it published twice as many issues after Commodore had gone bankrupt than it did when the company was still around. And if it came back today, if only for one issue, with the same approach, with the same quality, perhaps even the same team involved where possible, I have no doubt that it would be rewarded with a huge thank you by the people who loved it and were influenced by it, especially those who were steered into a career in IT or the creative arts through it, myself included. And one of the best things for me here in this library area of the cave at the Retro Collective, and our mission to preserve all of the games, all of the systems and all of the magazines here, is that I've nearly, not quite, but nearly got a complete Amiga Format collection back. I've certainly got the Amiga Format collection back that I had back in the day, those first 55 issues. What happened to them, you may ask, because they're not my original ones up here on the shelves. Well, I came back from university one day to find that my dad had had a tidy up, and that great big stack of Amiga formats, ST format, all the way back before issue 1 of Amiga Format, and then PC magazines beyond that, had all gone to landfill. We've made amends since, but it was a difficult time for our relationship when I discovered that. So to have these back again is just fantastic, and then to be able to see what happened next, because I'm slowly reading my way through the later ones to get an idea of what those who clung on to the Amiga enjoyed, or the ride they had to go through as they hung on to the machine they so loved. Because when I moved to PC, I didn't give the magazine a second look on the shelf. It was just the PC magazines that I was interested in. So it's an absolute pleasure to be able to collect these again, to be able to share these with you through the video, but also with anyone who would like to come and visit. Head to retrocollective.co.uk if you'd like to book a ticket to come and visit. As always, thank you for taking the time to watch, and we'll see you in the next video here at the Retro Collective. Take care. Bye-bye.